The Mexican Council on Foreign Relations presents Coyuntura Comexi. In today's episode, Elections and Democracy in India, a conversation with Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia, Associate Professor of Politics and Jarislowsky Democracy Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University. Just for context, how do elections work in India and who were the main contenders in this election?
India is a federal parliamentary democracy. It has a first-past-the-post system. It has had elections since 1951-52. Every election, until China becomes a democracy, becomes the world's biggest election in history, or until India stops becoming until India is no longer a democracy, which I hope, of course, never happens. There are elections both at the national level and also at the state level. And they're not concurrent, which means that in some national elections, some states go to the polls. So your voters are both electing a state-level government, a provincial government, and a national. But otherwise, across a parliamentary term, there are elections for state-level governments. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing is, as many of your listeners would know, it's a massive country. It's 1.4 billion. The electorate in this election in 2024 was almost a billion. I think it was 970 million were eligible to vote. And the states of India, many are larger than the biggest countries in the world. So, a medium-sized state might be 30 million people. A large state like Uttar Pradesh is over 200 million people, which would make it one of the 5 largest countries in the world. And many of the states, particularly once you leave the northern Hindi, what's called the Hindi heartland, where the dominant language, but not the only language, is Hindi. If you go to the east, for instance, the state of West Bengal, Bengali is the dominant language, and there are many other languages. If you go south, there are many other languages. So the way I like to describe it sometimes is when you think about the Indian party system, think of the European Union. Right? There are socialist parties in Sweden and there are socialist parties in Portugal. But they contest their power in different languages. And the meaning of socialism in these countries and the histories and the policies, although they're broadly similar, can be quite distinct. So the idioms of struggle in these states, the party systems, the political sociology of these states can be quite different. And there's a particular north-south cleavage in India. So it's an incredibly complex polity. And it's under those conditions that elections take place. A few other features of it that are quite interesting is historically, the more socially disadvantaged you are, and this is particularly since the late 1980s, early 1990s, the more socially disadvantaged you are, the higher propensity you have to vote in India, which is very much against the norm in the Western democratic world, where the better off you are socially and economically, the more likely you are to vote. In India, it tends to be almost the opposite, which means that the vast majority of the population and absolute poverty has declined tremendously in India over the last few decades, but there's so many people who live just above the poverty line. There's great inequalities. They've actually grown over the last 20 years. They're very important in elections, and they vote in great numbers. And what we saw, as we'll get into in our conversation, what we just saw last week was a great surprise, which one of India's most able sophologists and now a political movement builder foresaw, but nobody else really quite did. But this has happened historically. The Indian voters can surprise their political class and much of the world. They did it in 1977 when they threw out Mrs. Gandhi, who had suspended democratic rule for 2 years. They did in 2004, the last time the BJP was running a coalition government of a very different type. And the electorate threw that government out. They haven't thrown this government out, but it was a shock. I think certainly the ruling party and most election observers didn't see this one coming. So that tells you just a little bit about the system, and that was only your first question. Who are the main parties? So the ruling party is the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party. It's a very old party. It had a different name before the 1980s. The movement of Hindu nationalism goes back at least essentially formally. It's Its main organization is something called the RSS, the Russia Swayamsevak Sangh. And the basic idea is they think of India as fundamentally a Hindu nation. India is a multi-religious polity, 7 major religions. It has a form of secularism, or it did have a form, it constitutionally has a form of secularism, which is quite distinct. It is not like the American model, which is freedom. It's like the American model in the sense that it's freedom to religion, but it doesn't have a distinct wall of separation thesis. So the way we think about it is the American model of secularism, and this is a bit of a simplification, is freedom to religion. The French model is freedom from religion, laïcité. And the Indian model has often been described as freedom among religions. So the state tries to maintain a certain distance from religions while making sure that everyone has religious liberty. But historically, what it has done since independence is it has tried to reform the most egregious social practices of Hinduism through a series of reforms that began in the 1950s, while allowing minority communities, particularly Muslims, in the wake of partition, to reform their own social practices, their own personal laws, governing marriage and divorce and inheritance and so on. And this is important because that led to the charge right from independence amongst Hindu nationalists that India's ruling elite, the Nehruvian elite that first ruled India, was treating India's major religious communities unfairly. That they were favoring Muslims and targeting and stigmatizing Hindus. And so you hear these claims that the Congress Party in particular dabbles in minority appeasement, or that the Nehruvian regime was pseudo-secular because it didn't treat everyone equally. And there's something to that, because it was a decision of that early Congress ruling elite to, in the wake of partition and the tragedy and the horror of partition, to somehow, to grant Muslims and their many communities, many sects in India, that autonomy to govern themselves. It's important to understand that, that again, the population of Muslims in India today would make it the 3rd largest Muslim country in the world, after Pakistan and Indonesia. So it's a vast population. So the Hindu Nationalist Party has been in power since 2014, and it has been in a majority, and therefore it has, for the first time in its history, been relatively unhindered in pursuing its Hindu nationalist agenda, which it has. So it struck down Article 370 in the Constitution in 2019, which gave special constitutional rights to the Muslim majority state of Kashmir. It won through a court case, long-running court case, the right to build a temple in Ayodhya, where a mosque was destroyed in 1992, causing the worst communal riots since independence. And before this election, it was planning also to introduce what's called a uniform civil code, so that Muslims and other religious minorities wouldn't have their special personal laws. There would be a uniform civil code, which many feminists, many progressives thought was generally a good thing, because a lot of the personal laws that govern minority communities can be quite patriarchal and regressive. But the fear was that the version of the Uniform Civil Code that the BJP would introduce would be influenced disproportionately by a conservative Hindu understanding of what family law should be. And there have been a number of other issues that many of your listeners will know about simply reading the press, of introduction of cow protection laws, which are targeted minorities and Dalits and so on in the last 10 years. So that was the main party. That's the ruling party, which is still the largest. And the main competitor was the Congress Party, which dominated Indian politics from the 1950s until the late 1980s, ran a coalition government for 10 years before 2014, but had been in relative decline and really looked like it was in a free fall politically, that it somehow couldn't recover. But it did in the last couple of years, and it's done better in this election than many expected. So those are the two main national parties. And then there are literally dozens of parties that compete for office in India. I mean, hundreds that compete, but dozens that make it into parliament.
How would you characterize the state of democracy in India, and are there nuances to the idea of democratic backsliding in this country?
So let's just sort of maybe establish some basic definitions, right? So democratic backsliding is a concept, like all concepts in the social sciences, can be contested. The basic idea is that the norms, institutions, and practices we associate with good democratic governance are eroding in some way. And then it has a number of manifestations, classically. One is executive overreach, that the executive arm of the state accumulates more power vis-a-vis the legislature and the judiciary, and also vis-a-vis civil society, so that there's a sort of crackdown on independent civic organizations or a suppression of civil liberties, sometimes maybe even veering into the political rights of minority groups of various kinds. And another feature of democratic backsliding, as you mentioned, is the idea of how do you define the people, right? What constitutes the people? And you get different versions. You can get a sort of left populist version and a right populist version. And in India, it's a really right populist version, which is defining the nation in exclusive in sort of an ethno-nationalist frame, right? That Hindus are the natural citizens of India, and others may live there, may reside there, may have done so for centuries, but somehow they're not native to India, right? Particularly in religious terms, Christians and Muslims, their holy lands lie outside the borders of the continent, the subcontinent. So I think it is a debate in India. There are some who argue against the idea that there's been backsliding, but I think if you look at the basic dimensions, there's been growing illiberalism in India, growing suppression of civil liberties of writers, scholars, activists, journalists. We see growing media suppression we have in the last decade. We've seen, so that's just one set of issues. I've mentioned a few of the laws they've pushed through, which seem to infringe upon minority rights in various ways, particularly against Muslims. We've seen an accumulation of power in New Delhi, and this takes various forms. There's a centralization of power vis-a-vis the states and the federal system. There's a concentration of power in the prime minister's office vis-a-vis cabinet and the council of ministers. India has a parliamentary cabinet form of government. And there's also a personalization of power, which we often associate in some cases in democratic backsliding, right? The idea of a personality cult, that there is a leader, a strong man who embodies and represents the people, the nation as a whole. And we've seen all of that happening in India over the last decade. So I think that is all true. Now, you asked for nuances. So what would the nuances be? So I think one of the things, of course, is that the Indian Constitution has many liberal elements, right? Many fundamental rights, which are civil liberties and political rights. But there have also always been within the Constitution clauses, for instance, for emergency powers or restrictions on those rights. And that's that's constitutionally. And then in terms of India's political culture, long before the BJP came to power, there has been successive governments in New Delhi and in various states, which can often be quite intolerant, even hostile. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression are the two that often come up. So, India India was often described as a liberal democracy, but it was also a very complex liberal democracy. So there were really important liberal freedoms that came from the Constitution in 1950 and the Constituent Assembly that produced it. But there are also certain restrictions on those liberal freedoms. So like many post-colonial constitutions, it had both important liberties and rights, but it also had some important powers for the state. And that may have been greater in terms of, say, special emergency powers or limits on liberties than we might see in some other constitutions in the West. So I think that would be the nuance I would give. I suppose the other one is that you've already kind of said it. I mean, this threat of majoritarianism based on the idea that there's a single indivisible people and it's defined in ethno-nationalist terms is something that we've seen in many countries over the last decade. So India's become part of this broader pattern. But I've certainly in my own writing and my own research, and like many others, have documented what I would describe as backsliding. And it's to the point where I think before this election, there was a growing consensus, I think, amongst many scholars of India, in India, outside of India, who've been studying it for a long time, that India had become more illiberal. So it had declined from a liberal democracy to an electoral democracy. And that was quite well documented. It provoked a lot of controversy, for instance, when Freedom House downgraded India to partly free a few years ago. VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Project, downgraded India to an electoral autocracy. And that crossed that line from democracy to autocracy. And I think for the longest time in this election, it was pivotal in this sense. There has been a debate where some people say, can we still call it the world's largest democracy? Because the ruling party had accumulated all kinds of special advantages that it had, in a sense, introduced in terms of money, in terms of schemes to acquire campaign finance, which really advantaged the ruling party. Its control over the media, the mainstream media really buckled under the pressure of this party. Its interference with independent institutions like the Supreme Court. There were many controversies saying that the executive was interfering or pressuring or influencing the work of the court. Many moves to limit the autonomy of independent public institutions, let alone organizations in civil society. So the fear was that, is it the case that not only is India becoming more illiberal, but that the playing field to conduct a free and fair election through the way campaign finance is organized, through the autonomy or the lack of autonomy of the election commission, is it the case that the electoral field is tilted to such an extent in favor of the ruling party that you could not have a free and fair election? And that was the great fear before the election, which took place over several weeks that just concluded. And I think in that sense, it's a great relief and it's a ringing endorsement. There's so many issues that India has to contend with now. But this was a free and fair election. This was an election that, despite being advantaged in many ways to the ruling party, still inflicted serious losses, right, on the ruling party. It lost lost over 60 seats. It was declined. It was denied a majority on its own in parliament. And so I think that electoral mechanism in Indian democracy was still robust enough, even with all the accumulated advantages that the ruling party had accrued to itself of money and muscle and control over institutions and control over the media, mainstream media in particular. Even with all those advantages that it had accrued and tried to take advantage of, to tilt the playing field, that it was still a competitive enough contest that voters who were dissatisfied with the ruling party in various states for various reasons could register their protest and vote for other parties.
Prime Minister Modi did get a mandate for a third term, but the call to action of 400 of 400 to get a supermajority in parliament failed. What can be said about public sentiment to better understand this result?
So the number, just to put it in context, in order to form a government in India, in New Delhi, the national government, you have to win 272 seats or more in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. In 2019, the BJP had won 303 by itself, and it was in a coalition with other parties, which increased its seat tally to about 350 out of roughly 540 seats, a little bit over 540 is in the parliament. So it had campaigned to say it was going to win 370 seats on its own, and the coalition would win 400 seats. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because if it had achieved 370 seats or more by itself, and certainly if it had won 400 seats or more with its allies in the National Democratic Alliance, that was a coalition that it formerly was the head of, it would have a supermajority in parliament, which means it could change the constitution. And that's really critical to understand at least one of the factors that led to it losing votes in some critical states, not least in one of its bastions, which is Uttar Pradesh, the largest state in the country. So one of the reasons there was a setback was a fear, which the opposition played up very astutely and effectively, that if the BJP was going to come to power, it was going to change the constitution. Because, many of its actions over the last decade, many observers would say were against the constitution, right? Its values, its values, its principles, and certainly some of its provisions. I mentioned the abrogation of Article 370, which was a constitutional provision that the BJP did away with, right? So it wanted to change the constitution. And so the opposition very effectively mobilized a campaign to say, if the BJP wins 370 seats or 400, it could change the constitution so that would formally become a non-secular state, that it would be a Hindu national state, that they would introduce certain provisions and changes and amendments in the constitution to undermine or eradicate the secular character of the constitution. Now, the court would, of course, get involved in this, but the court had buckled under pressure of the BJP in many instances in the last decade. And there was one particular provision that the opposition rallied around, which was the idea of reservations, which are collective quotas for jobs and places in higher education for Dalits, the lowest caste in the sort of traditional caste order. And that was a fear they had, that somehow the BJP was going to undermine this very important provision that would give them special quotas for jobs in central government services and higher education and so on. And so that struck a chord. The other reason that we saw in certain states, again, like UP and other places, is that India's growth has been very high in the last 2 decades, although it suffered its greatest recession since independence during the pandemic. But generally the case when Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, one of the reasons he was so popular is he promised that he would modernize the Indian economy, in particular by creating millions of good manufacturing jobs and expanding infrastructure. So infrastructure has expanded under his tenure, continuing what had happened in previous administrations, but the government gets credit for that. So roads, rail, ports, airports have expanded. There's been expansion of the rural banking services through much of the countryside. There's been something called the India Stack, so this digital public infrastructure, which has many controversial sides to it, but there are also many boosters of it, has developed. So infrastructure, digital and old-fashioned hardcore physical infrastructure has really developed under Mr. Modi. But the promise that there would be many good jobs in the manufacturing sector for the millions of young Indians entering the labor force every year did not materialize. In fact, investment and growth declined over those years in the first term. And like I said, suffered a huge recession during the pandemic. We also saw rising agrarian distress. A vast majority of India's labor force still resides in the countryside and is reliant on agriculture for its livelihood. So we saw a stagnation of wages or a depression in certain regions. And so entering this election, unemployment or the lack of good jobs, underemployment, and food inflation in particular were real concerns. So you had very high levels of economic growth in terms of headline growth figures. India's the fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 2 years. You have, but you also had rising inequality, right? So at the top end, we talk about a K-shaped recovery in many countries since the pandemic. So India had versions of that. If you were in the urban middle classes living in the cities of India, in the formal sector, you have done relatively well. You've done probably quite well, if not extremely well, over the last 10 years. But if you're in the informal sector, if you're reliant on agriculture, if you're on poorer states, your economic prospects are quite dim. And that growth in inequality and that real acute stress when it came to inflation and underemployment and unemployment was another nerve. And I'll mention one more, that as I mentioned, this party, this government, since it's come to power, has really concentrated power and has really accumulated executive power. And it's also cracked down on civic organizations, on independent activists, journalists, writers, scholars, and so on. It's also tried to break a number of opposition parties. It's contested elections. Opposition parties have defeated the ruling party in state elections at various points over the last decade. So that's what I said. The elections, despite the advantages the ruling parties accrue, that they're still competitive enough that the ruling party can lose. But it is, through various means, through what many would see as sort of efforts to bribe opposition politicians or to accuse them of breaking the law, so to use the investigative arm of the state to try to detain or lock up or imprison opposition politicians and wrangle them in courts. It is tried to, in a sense, suppress opposition voices, and it has done that. It has done that for several years, and in the run-up to this election, there was a sense, this would be the sort of third big factor, that it had gone too far. There were two chief ministers in particular that had prosecuted for crimes of corruption. Many people thought they were highly politically motivated and politicized, and there wasn't any basis to them. One was the chief minister of the state of Delhi, who was a very popular chief minister, another of an eastern state in India, and a state called Jharkhand. And people felt that it's simply gone too far, right? That it wasn't playing fair anymore. And it's interesting, two parties in the state of Maharashtra, two regional parties, which the ruling party was instrumental in breaking apart into two different factions. The factions that the ruling party supported in the election lost to the other factions that survived. And this was seen as a sign that the voters were upset with the fact that the fair political competition wasn't taking place. So the ruling party was trying to undermine that. And so there was a blow against that. So as I was saying, this is a massive continental polity. And in any election verdict in any country, there are many factors that go into it. And India is no different. It might be even more the case. But I think these are three really important ones. Everyday economic concerns, a sense that the ruling party had become too arrogant, that it was sort of a politics of hubris, and a fear that if it accumulated too much power, it would really begin to undermine the autonomy and integrity of public institutions, of civil society, of the possibility of political opposition altogether. And so some of the opposition very much contested this election, saying democracy was on the ballot, and tried to rally the electorate on those grounds.
How do you see this social sentiment projecting into the structures of power, and for India to project that into the world?
So I think what is clear, you're right, is that, we've seen this in the last decade and a half, the rise of many protest parties on the left and the right, a rise in populism in many countries, again, versions of left and right, growing discontent and frustration with democratic politics in many countries. And there are many factors involved. The rise of social media, which exacerbates social polarization, a breakdown of trust in traditional political elites. But of course, an underlying factor is growing inequalities that we've seen over the last few decades. Many on the left, of course, or even now centrists, would say that this is a function of neoliberal economic policies, which has accentuated inequality and undermined the public sphere more generally in many regions around the world. I think from what I've seen, only Brazil, depending on what, of course, you begin your analysis and when you end it, but from the 1990s till the last decade, it was only Brazil that saw a slight diminution in its levels of inequality, sort of standard conventional measures of Gini coefficients and so on. The rest of the world has seen an increase in inequality within countries on class terms, in terms of income and wealth. So I think that's a structural feature of the global political economy. And at the end of the day, there's always been debates about democratic consolidation and what somebody might call deconsolidation. Latin Americans actually have been very prominent in this debate. Think of people like Juan Linz or Guillermo O'Donnell. There's a big debate between them on the whole idea of consolidation. O'Donnell always was skeptical that democracies would ever fully consolidate it. There was always a struggle, and they were always vulnerable to challenges of various kinds. But I do think that that's something that's come through in the last decade and a half, that, if democracies are unable to satisfy the basic demands of large sectors of their citizenry, then the legitimacy of these democracies begins to be questioned. We often think of a sort of classic distinction of procedural democracy and and procedural legitimacy, democracy, procedural legitimacy and performance legitimacy. And a classic distinction that's often been made is that authoritarian regimes only have one form of legitimacy. They have to modernize, they have to grow, they have to provide something, a material improvement in people's living conditions, security, although they can be very repressive towards their own citizens. But there has to be some improvement in material conditions in order to buttress their legitimacy, because they're seen as illegitimate otherwise in procedural terms, right? They don't represent or have a mandate of the people. They don't have the consent of the people. And democracies were seen to have procedural legitimacy because people consented to being governed by a particular set of parties through elections. And I think what has come through in the last decade and a half is that democracies always also had a very important basis in performance legitimacy. And there's been lots of scholarship about this, that the heyday of democracies, we think of as a post-war era, certainly in the Northwest, the North Atlantic world, is not coincidentally when they established welfare states and when they pursued, Keynesian policies by and large, trying to maximize employment. And we begin to see more instability when there's a rise of unemployment, a growing sense of precarity amongst workers, growing insecurity to do with the retrenchment of welfare services in many countries. So I think that's the broad kind of structural character of the global economy in this sort of neoliberal era that has destabilized many ruling establishments and given voters a cause for concern to say, what is it whom do our governments represent? And are they able to tackle the problems that we face, the social and economic challenges that we face every day? So I think that's where India is part of that story. It helped actually bring Mr. Modi to power. India actually had its highest rate of growth and a new welfare system before he came to power. But in the immediate 2 years for the 2014 election, the growth declined and there were massive corruption scandals. And we've often seen that as being a recipe for the rise of populists as well. That there's sort of a corrupt, unequal order and that a strong man is going to fix it. And that had a great appeal in India in 2014. We've seen it in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it in Poland. We've seen it in Turkey with Mr. Erdogan. And we could count of other number of examples. I think Mr. Netanyahu and Israel. It's often the case the ones I've just picked tend to be right-wing, autocratic populists, again, who have a very sort of ethnic understanding of the nation, an ethno-majoritarian understanding. So I think that's how I answered that part of your question. The other issue, I think, is more complicated. I think it's very important. There are global inequalities in the international order. And India, like South Africa, like Brazil, like Indonesia, Turkey in this case, I mean, many of the other big powers in the G20 have been demanding for a long time that the international order is not a level playing field. It is biased and favors Western interests. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Whether you look at it from trade, the trade regime, or climate change, or public health, certainly where power resides in the IMF and the World Bank and the other major multilateral institutions, of course, the UN Security Council, there's been a demand. Mexico, of course, Mexico, I imagine, is an interesting case because it's part of what was called NAFTA before and very closely tied and integrated with the American economy, and it's benefited from that in many ways. But of course, it is also a Southern power as well. So there's been a demand to redress these imbalances in authority and power and influence in the international order. A way of putting it is, and you often hear this in India and other countries, that the rules-based international order, which is something that we often hear people in the West use as a term, are a set of rules that are really biased, that they favor Western industrial democracies. And I think we've seen many instances of that. I think the most vivid one was during the pandemic, where actually it was India and South Africa that went to the WTO and asked for a suspension of the TRIPS agreement to allow vaccines to be manufactured without protecting of patents around the world, because this was a global emergency. And it was very revealing that it was the Western democracies, in particular the industrial ones, Canada, the United States, Europe that really frustrated that at the WTO, that they wanted to protect private property rights when it came to the manufacturing of vaccines, even in a global public emergency. And it was these countries in the South that said we have to change this order.